money that she got by selling her eldest child, she would essentially be able to feed her two younger children. And then that older child would become one of the infamous chimney sweepers. So this is a 3-year-old child in the 19th century. And the reason that they had them that small was so they could fit into the chimney and they could sweep and clean it on the inside. So there's a very famous poem called The Chimney Sweeper about a little kid, and then he ends up dying in the end. So it's really sad. They don't really make it to age 15. And then by the time they're like 7 years old, they don't really fit in the chimney anymore, so they have to go work in factories. So really bad time to be a poor child. And then lastly, we have the famous rope beds. So because the factories worked first come, first serve, if you were not in line in the morning, you were not going to work in the factory that day. You weren't really employed as an employee. You just had to show up to work. And so what a lot of men did is they would have ropes, and then this is where they would sleep 3 to 4 hours and go back to their shifts. So they would never leave the factory. So super bad time to not be upper class. And today we're going to focus on what changes happened at the urban scale that react to all this. And we're specifically going to be looking at Paris again. So I chose Paris because we've already seen it. You already know the state of Paris at this time. You know, we have a couple of royal squares being built, just a couple of punch outs in the city. But overall, it's still very congested, very dense grain. And so the question is, how do we get from this in the early 19th century to this just 60 years later? And notice how much growth, right? So this is the city wall on that prior image. Notice that there was a little bit of faubourgs going on, but for the most part, that's countryside. And in the next 60 years, all of this is going to populate itself. And on top of that, we do see some major changes on the actual grid of the city for several reasons. So similar to London, Paris is also going to be industrialized, crowded, dirty, and of course we're going to have the people of the lower classes being exploited. That's pretty universal at the time. And because of that, Paris is going to have a lot of manifestations. But specifically in France, we also have a tradition of barricading. So has anyone here watched Les Mis? No one? Okay, so you know what I'm talking about. So barricades essentially, we'll get there. So these are barricades. So barricades happen when you have a group of people in the inner city that are very upset with what's going on with their government. And so what they do is they throw out everything in their homes, so furniture, trash, pieces of the actual building to create these, which are the barricades themselves. And what this does is it essentially cuts off a section from the city from being circulated by anyone. So not only is this bad economically because you can't really have trade routes moving through here, but it's also bad because now the military and the army is cut off from an entire section of the city, meaning that they cannot put down this revolt. And so revolution quite literally runs in the blood of French cities. And then there is this saying that says, when France sneezes, the rest of Europe catches a cold. And that refers to whenever France has some kind of revolution or they're doing something politically, the rest of Europe usually follows. And so it's in the best interest of everyone, not just France, but also the rest of Europe, that France is contained because they are so influential, and if they have an uprising, everyone else is going to have one as well. So this is a cartoon of the time of what housing looks like in Paris, where we can see we have machinery on the bottom, and then on the sort of bottom 2 floors over here, we have a couple people living on top. But if you look really closely at it, there's children in cribs inside of here as their parents work. So it's a critique of the way in which industrialization has essentially deteriorated the nuclear family and all the values that come along with that. And it's also massively changed the way that people live in cities. So because of that, we have the barricades. And this is an image that shows that the barricades were not just a sort of singular wall, but they were walls on walls on walls. So it was entire districts inside of Paris that would revolt and be upset, and this was their way of getting back at the crown because they knew that by cutting off trade routes, the city would suffer economically. And so by hitting them in their pockets, it was believed that they would be able to make some sort of change in the political system. So just to give you an idea of what France is going through at the time period, the era we're talking about is from right here, Second Empire, to the Consulate. And you can see how many governments we have in between there. So first French Revolution, 1789, from there up until 1804, is going to be like 6 to 7 different governments, right? Every time they don't like it, they just rebuild it. So rather than amending the constitution or doing a small change, France really likes to just destroy everything and start all over again. So that's going to create a lot of unrest and barricading. We have our first empire, which is going to be Napoleon. So 15 years of somewhat stability in the first empire. Napoleon gets taken down. Then we have a couple of monarchies. So at this point, they're like, you know what? All of this wasn't really a great idea. How about we just restore the original line of kings and somewhat go back to stability? That doesn't really work out. And so they have a second revolution where they put in some other guy, and we have the July monarchy. And this is going to be an important point for urban planning because we're going to see the introduction of 2 things at this time. But for the majority of this class, we're going to be focusing on what happens in the Third French Revolution, which is the Second Republic, or Napoleon's grandson, Napoleon III. So the second, or the July Revolution, brought about new institutions, libraries, theaters, hospitals, prisons, asylums. Why do you guys think that someone who's trying to create stability in France would want to have these types of institutions? Yes, to make the people happy. So as we've seen, this is a common pattern that goes all the way back to ancient Greece and Rome. If you are a ruler and you want to make your people happy, you have to give them things to do, entertainment, places to learn. You can't just leave them without anything because then they'll get bored. They'll start to see what's wrong with the government and they're going to revolt. So we open up all these systems and keep in mind that these are universal. So they also help the lower classes, which is going to deter them from barricading. And then the second thing is we also have the introduction of railroads. This is going to be absolutely huge in all of Europe, and in Paris we're going to see we have around 6 to 7 lines that are brought right into the edge of the city. So if you recall from last semester, we talked about the introduction of iron in public libraries and how shocking that was at the time. That is happening during this sort of second revolution. And then we have our train terminals, which remember are nice and stone facaded on the front, and then on the back they're this industrial train shed, so that same thing applies in Paris. But on an urban scale, notice where all the terminals are. Right? So if we sort of toggle between the 2 of these, you can begin to see where those lines are, where they are leading to. And notice that our city walls at the time are going to be around here. So why do you guys think that those terminals are going to be located where they are? Yes?
Because it was the edge of the city at that time.
Yes, and why wouldn't they want to go into the center of the city?
So that they wouldn't contain the space.
Yes, partially that, and because it was expensive. And yes, you were going to have people barricading because you're destroying their homes if you go all the way to the center of the city. So what they did was they decided to build the terminals on the edge of what Paris was at the time, on the outermost wall of the time period. So we know by studying the train routes where Paris was in the 1830s. Now notice that the routes go pretty much everywhere, right? And that's because Paris is the capital of France. It's sort of in the center of France, so you need lines that go more or less to the rest of the country to keep it well connected. All right, so now we're going to move on to the bulk of this lecture, which is going to be our third revolution. So Louis Philippe, who was our July monarch, turned out to be the same exact thing that they were mad about in the first place. So they overthrew him as well. And then we have Napoleon III. And Napoleon is going to offer us a pretty good era of stability at this time. And he does so by using the urban grid to his advantage. So compared to the other monarchs who didn't really focus too much on improving the city, Napoleon III made the city his entire project for the whole, bulk of his reign. So, by improving Paris, he hopes to do 2 things. Number 1, bring France back as the #1 European power with the best and most beautiful city. And number 2, prevent another revolution. This new city is going to focus on our rising middle class, or what they call the bourgeoisie in France. And the bourgeoisie is mostly going to be looking for safety, transportation, entertainment. This is a different type of class, right? So they're not the upper class who can retreat to the countryside, but they're also not the lower class who's just going to be working in factories. They're going to have some free time, especially the women and the heirs to the bourgeois factory owners. And so they're going to need things to do. Otherwise, they're going to back up whoever decides to make a coup. And so Napoleon III, knowing all this, decides to create a new city that focuses on them as the target demographic. So middle class slash bourgeoisie is going to be who we are catering to with this new city. So he hired this guy named Haussmann, which is a pretty easy name to remember. It's kind of like Houseman. So Haussmann decides to help him rebuild Paris in around the span of 20 years or so. And Haussmann has several ideas. Napoleon III really just wants to prevent barricades. But Haussmann is the first person that thinks about the city not as a grid of different pieces, but as an overall concept. And so the idea that a city can have a unified building or urban concept arises in the 19th century thanks to Haussmann. So the major changes are going to be 11 of them. So we're going to go through each of them. Number one, we have nodal organization. So before, notice that the grain of Paris is very tight and very dense. And what happens with this is if you barricade here, you're going to be cutting off all of this or all of this from trade, depending on which way you're trying to block. When we have nodal organization, we now have all of these little pockets of spaces, and notice how wide those streets are. So now, if you are going to barricade, right, you might block off this tiny little street here, but you can't block off these major streets. So we're making the city much more permeable. And what that does is it prevents people from revolting and creating barricades, and that's good for Napoleon III because it means he's not going to have people trying to overthrow him as quickly. So I hope you can see how all of the places with the red are now sort of like nodal points that lead to all these streets in the city, right? Whereas in the old city, you can't really identify these, and inside each of these nodal points, they are going to create some sort of focus. So it's either going to lead to an existing development, like a train station, an opera house, the royal properties, or they are going to create new sort of traffic circles where they're going to have columns. The Arc of Triomphe is around this time period, something to visually mark the landscape. So it's not just about making it more permeable, but it's also about making it a more beautiful city. So Haussmann creates this map, right, and he pretty much maps where all the major landmarks are. He creates a sense of hierarchy, and he goes, these are the landmarks that are beautiful and important that I want to highlight with my new map. And then he begins to create connections between them, and we can see how he's beginning to carve out the city and create larger boulevards and a much more expansive streetscape that makes it a better place for trade, but also a worse place to revolt. So we, again, always have this sort of dual nature when it comes to the 19th century organization of Paris. The second thing that comes with that is widened streets. So Paris, prior to this, is still going to be very medieval in terms of how its streets are laid out. You can see they're very narrow. Some streets are only 5 feet wide. So to barricade those is very, very easy. And again, people just kind of throw things out their window. So everything they can find in their homes, they throw, and they build these sort of dams for the actual streets. When we have these new widened boulevards, you can't really do that anymore, right? These are multi-lane streets. Some of them are as wide as the ones in Vegas. So you're really only going to block off this much of it if you decide to barricade, which isn't very effective. So you're pretty much helping to suppress any revolutions before they actually happen by using the city as a tool. So this is how wide the streets become eventually, and we can see that they're starting to line them with trees. So there is this effort to make a more beautiful city and also integrate nature as a response to industrialization in these new streets as well. So today, that same street we can see is still very, very wide. We have around 10 lanes, which again are hard to block, and very wide sidewalks. So it is a walkable city. And why do you need to have a walkable city? because that's what the bourgeoisie likes to do at the time, right? Remember when we talked about the 18th century city, I asked who here has watched Bridgerton, because the middle class, like in the Regency era, likes to walk and promenade and stroll and walk from one landmark to the other. So by giving them these really wide sidewalks, you are making it a more accessible and beautiful city in which you're gonna be focused on having a nice leisurely time over overthrowing the monarch. Then Hosmer decides to have those visual terminations. So 1, 2, and 3 are kind of the same thing, but I'm just breaking them down to give you more imagery. So previously, notice how we have the opera house sort of in the background, and we have these buildings sort of zigzagging in front of it. They block off pieces of it. After Hosmer redoes Paris, he creates the street to directly lead you there. So it makes these sites more accessible for the bourgeoisie. It makes beautiful streets for them to promenade on to get there. And then again, it opens up the urban grid a little bit more. So now it's a lot more breathable, and we can have more beautiful matching facades rather than all of that mess, right? So we're starting to see how the destruction of medieval Paris is leading to a more middle-class oriented city. So to give you an idea of how these streets work, we're gonna be looking at this street right here, right? And keep in mind, this is the Louvre right here, right? So our old city wall we looked at was here, then it was here, and at this time period it's gonna be somewhere out here, so we can see the rings of growth. So that first street goes from the gardens of the Tuileries Palace, the one that Catherine Medici built, and then it leads us all the way to the Arc de Triomphe, and then it keeps going. You know, there's other ones, but we're just gonna focus up until this point. So it leads us from those gardens, then it leads us to a Place de la Concorde, so a French square that we didn't talk about, but it's there. And finally, it leads us to that arch. And then it keeps going and going and going. There's more and more things to look at. Then on the other hand, we have this street. Though it is not straight, it does have nodal points that lead us from the Louvre to the Opera House, and finally to the train station that goes to the north of France. So as you're standing in the gardens of the Louvre, you can see how we have these visual landmarks as the street continues to go, right? We have the garden, the Place de la Concorde, we have the Arc de Triomphe, and then all the way in the back, we have La Défense. Does anyone remember that development when we talked about high-tech architecture last semester? Yes?
Something like the convention center?
Yeah, it was like their business district. They kept it out there so they wouldn't have to have skyscrapers in the heart of Paris. And you can see that it's not just one road leading there, right? We have around 8 different roads that have a visual termination at the Arc of Triomphe, which is why this is a very popular roundabout and it's constantly having a lot of traffic. From the Louvre, the second route I showed you goes to the Opera House, which we see back here. So we see how it's very clearly a visual termination. And then that leads us into the northern train station. A fourth change that Hosmer is going to introduce is he's going to add new squares. And these squares aren't going to be closed off like the royal ones. They are going to be these nice open plazas. Usually they're going to have some sort of greenery and become urban parks, small urban parks. So this is going to be the Place de la République. It's going to be the largest pedestrian zone in Paris to date, so it is incredibly large. So we're seeing how the scale of these squares are changing. Because they are not exclusive to who lives there anymore, and they are now public and open to anyone, especially that middle class, we do have to improve the size of them. Notice that they still sort of have a statue in the middle, probably Napoleon III, trying to tell the city, I brought you guys this new square here. And then they would have eventually switched him out once he was out. So we can see this is, to this day, a very popular square. So lots of protests happen here. If something is happening in Paris, it's probably going to be in the Place de la République. Number 5, we have new services and building regulations. So the concept of building codes wasn't really a thing prior to the 19th century. So we really have to thank Hosmer for this idea of codes that architects have to work with today. So to give us an idea of what the before was, Notice how this is a very kind of hodgepodgey building where everything is sort of built on top of each other. There is no regulation or sense of beauty that's really put into the building itself. So as you have generations, right, if your parents live in this bottom one and then you get married, you're sort of just going to build a floor on top of that. And then once your children are married, they build a floor on top of that, and so forth. So it is a very organic city, and because of that, there isn't really master planning going on. In the 19th century, Hosman decides to not just fix those facades, but also introduce what we call modern day services. So now we actually have water running through the city underground, clean, potable water. The concept of having water be cleaned and be treated and not just pulled straight out of a polluted river is also something that happened in the 19th century. And then we have gas lighting. So though this doesn't seem like such a big deal compared to water, it is actually huge because it provides a newfound level of safety, especially at night. Prior to this, electricity did not exist, and so Paris at night was incredibly dark, making it a very, very dangerous place to be. So once we introduce gas lighting, we are now making it a more walkable city at night. So if you're someone that's, say, going to the opera, you can now walk there at night, which is actually a very nice experience, right? And today, Paris is called the city of lights. So this is what it looked like when we were laying out our new plumbing infrastructure and at the same time widening our streets and at the same time creating visual terminations. So all of these are happening at the same time. Notice the amount of destruction that is going on the sides though. We'll talk about that in a second, because not everyone was happy with Hosman's efforts. Here's our new gas lighting. So we had two types of models, either they were wall mounted or they were singular light posts. And then we also have these interesting street urinals, right? So prior to this, people would just sort of pee wherever they wanted to, and it smelled really bad. And so by having urinals and sewage that sort of hooks up to these, they're helping to clean up the city as far as smell goes as well. All right, next thing that they do, de-densification. So I'm giving you the Ile de la Cité as our sort of case study, because remember that this is the oldest part of Paris, way back to Roman times. It's gonna be the densest grain that there is. Notice the scale of a little block in medieval Paris, and then notice the scale of the blocks today. So Hosman knows that the Ile de la Cité is especially a huge problem because all you have to do is barricade the bridges, and you've essentially blocked off the administrative center of Paris. So he knows we have to create better bridges into the Ile de la Cité, and we have to pretty much drive out the residential use by creating institutions on here and getting rid of that really tight grain that characterizes the Ile de la Cité. So to give us an idea, this is what it looked like before, where you can see it's sort of a whole jumble of houses going on. And then this is what it looks like after. And these are both taken from Notre Dame, which is located right here, looking down onto the rest of the Ile de la Cité. So all of that gets taken out, and then we have new public institutions put in place. And this is where we can see that they're starting to build up those new buildings. You can see that the streets are a lot wider. It is much easier to access it now. And here we have images of how the medieval grid of Paris is beginning to be demolished. So notice that they're putting in sewers over here. Then we have men clearing out the streets, creating those visual terminations, and also getting rid of the front of all the buildings that do not fit the agenda of these new streets. So in some cases, they would just chop off the entire building itself and then use the new building, give it a new facade, and then that way all your facades are nice and matching. Does anyone want to guess what these lines are? What would create soot on your walls? Yes?
Chimneys?
Yes. So this is where they essentially tore up a whole building, and they left a chimney wall where we can see where those chimneys would have been located inside of the building that was torn off. Right, so you can see that in order to keep warm, you did have to have chimneys on pretty much every level. They were very organic. It goes to show how medieval the city still was in many aspects. And so if you think about that 3-year-old little boy, he had to go all the way from up here through this dark chimney to clean it all the way down. So very tough work at the time. Here we see another image of the vast amount of demolition, another example of our chimneys, right? And then we have some over here as well. And so we have work going on the street level, underground, on the top level. Every level of this city is being completely redone, which does lead to people creating cartoons like these. So this was a critique of Hosman and his works at the time, where we see that we have Paris, right, who's usually a woman, and she's sort of being infested by all of these little demolition workers who are redoing the urban grid at the time. And the people who, of course, are going to suffer the most from this are going to be, to no surprise, the lower class, because they don't really have a say in what gets demolished and what doesn't. And so although the inside of Paris is getting redone and it's now getting these really wide boulevards, we have the creation of urban slums on the outside. So just because you get rid of the medieval fabric where poor people live does not mean you're going to get rid of the problem. And they're just going to go out to the outskirts and build shanty towns as best as they can. And that's where they're going to live for a while, right? So really this is a myth that we're beautifying Paris, because on the outskirts, it's even worse than it was before. But notice you can't really barricade on these either. So for Napoleon III, it's not really a huge concern. These people can barely afford to have a house, much less be throwing stuff out there to barricade. So it's not really a pressing issue for Napoleon or for Hosman at the time. Meanwhile, on the inner city, these new streets are going to have new housing for that upper bourgeoisie. And so what previously would have been vacant lots are now going to become these really beautiful townhomes. And notice how it's sort of a théâtre, what's the word, technique, where the stuff in the back doesn't really matter. So we have this super slanted facade, mismatching. All we're going to do is put these two in front of it, and that no longer exists. Just kind of out of sight, out of mind for the upper bourgeoisie class. So prior to these, this is what our streets would have looked like, right? We have them widened, but we don't have matching facades just yet. And then after we come back with this secondary layer of townhomes, we then create these. And I talked about these last semester, the sort of levels of people living in them. The typical Parisian house is going to be 6 levels. It's going to have some sort of retail on the bottom, and then we're going to have the social class hierarchy on those levels. So this is a cartoon from the time as well, where we have our lower middle class, usually going to be our shop owners, right, bakery, whatever it is. They're usually going to live on this mezzanine level. So if you notice, this has 6 levels, and we have this tiny little one right here. That is where the shop owners are usually going to live. In this cartoon, it only shows 5 levels, so just keep that in mind. Then we have our upper middle class, and what do you notice changes as far as the language of the interior architecture goes, or even the exterior architecture? Yes?
It's more ornate and it has a balcony.
It has more ornate and it has a balcony, and then we also have more height to it. So even today, higher ceilings are considered a luxury, and at the time that was especially true because the second level, or really in this case the third level, is going to be where upper bourgeoisie lives. And they have access to a balcony, which is a luxury at the time. They have higher ceilings, so they can have hanging chandeliers. Essentially, it's a really nice, luxurious penthouse, except it's on the, I guess, first level, right? Because remember, in Europe, it's ground, and then it's first level. Then we have our normal middle class, right? So the people who would be employed by the upper middle class, we're going to live up here. So notice that they no longer have a balcony, the ceilings are sort of high, but we're now starting to see a different dynamic inside, right? We have the women actually working, taking care of the children. They're not just sitting around and having servants wait on them. And then on the upper level, we have our lower middle class where we see we're now having a segmentation, smaller living quarters. We have our landlord right here asking for his rent. And then the uppermost is going to be where artists, like the idea of the struggling artist, this is where he's going to live. And we can see an artist here, lower class, photography. All of that's going to take place in the uppermost level of Parisian apartments. Now, why is the top not considered the penthouse or the most luxurious place? Because at the time, that was the hardest place to have any heat going, right? So in the winter, they were incredibly cold, and you also had leaking roofs because of the snow. And in the summer, because heat rises, it's gonna be the hottest spot in this entire complex. And so, the most accessible and most luxurious spot to be was here. Above the street, so it's not disgusting and you're not seeing all the people, right? But still close enough where you only have to go up one level upstairs. Number 8, Hosman also begins to rebuild and add new bridges. So remember, the one bridge we talked about, Pont Neuf, was the first open street that didn't have any homes on top of the bridge. And this is what it looks like at this time. Right, so we can see that although it's pretty modern for the 16th century, by the time we get to this time period, we need bigger arches because the boats are getting bigger and bigger. So if you continue building that way, you're blocking off your economic trade routes. If you make them a little bit wider, you can now have wider freight boats come in. And because we have industrialization going on, we can now have single span bridges going across the entirety of the river. So this is one of the nicest ones at the time where we can see several things are going on. Visual termination, gas lighting. We also have iron being used to construct these instead of stone. So now we can have a much wider span, so we can have wider craft to move in and out of the city. And some of these even open up, right? That's also invented in the 19th century. The next thing they do is they create the subterranean sewer system and also the subterranean train system. But we're just gonna go over the sewers today. So prior to Hosman, sewers were actually open like this, right? And this is in the meatpacking district of Paris. So if you were a butcher, you would essentially, clean out the meat that you're preparing, and then you would just kind of throw it into the water. And over years and years and years, all of that would begin to build up. It wouldn't really decompose as quickly as you wanted it to, and so these became sludge rivers that were really, really nasty, and they caused a lot of diseases to come up. Not because of the smell, but because of the proximity to decomposing matter in the water. So Paris decides to create an underground sewer system, and we can see that they're very large. They go all throughout the city. They run right underneath those streets. So as, again, they're building the top, they're also building down below. And they're considered such a cool innovation that the bourgeoisie decides to make this also a part of their entertainment. So they have these boats that, of course, our lower class men are gonna be pulling them through to have tours of the sewer. So it becomes sensationalized, and we can see how what is essentially work and very heavy work for one class of people becomes entertainment for a different class of people. And we even have women in these, right? So there was this other invention. Instead of boats, they have these little carts, and they're just kind of having a tour of the sewer. And because we have gas lamps now, you can see everything underneath there. Number 10, Hosman decides we need new food distribution centers. So we have Le Hall and Hall de la Villette, which we'll look at in a second. And the reason we need these is because they're still operating on medieval market squares, which, although they're great and you can get a lot of things at them, when the city gets too large, these become very chaotic. Excuse me. And they also become highly unsanitary because there is no regulation. If you're selling meat, if you're selling vegetables, you can just kind of leave your leftovers here, and then you would just assume someone will pick them up eventually, but no one really picks them up, and that's part of the reason why our streets are really gross at the time. So we create these new halls where we now have designated places where our vendors can come in, our farmers can come and sell their produce, and because they are now held accountable and because we have a trash collection system, it is a lot cleaner to actually obtain your food. So this is an example of what one market becomes. So whereas before a market square could have been this big, it is now about 12 times its size. And notice that the streets run right through it. Right, so now we can have our trucks coming in from the country, bringing in all of the produce straight into the supermarkets of sorts, and people can come shop here for everything. They don't have to go through 3 different markets to get what they need. And to this day, this is still a very popular tradition in France. You know, they do have modern day supermarkets, but the idea of going to a market and getting fresh produce, fresh bread, more artisanal pieces is still very popular. And it gets so popular that we can see they even outgrew it at some point. Now, the meat process was a little bit different. Because meat at the time, they didn't have refrigeration, they couldn't necessarily prepare the meat out in the countryside, so they had to bring the livestock into the actual city to actually slaughter it. So who remembers what this development is right here? So notice we have lines, we have points, and then we have planes. What is this?
Guard?
It is a park. Do you remember the name of the park or the movement associated with this? So this is going to be deconstructivism. This is going to be Parc de la Villette. Remember, they had the follies in these points, then they have the lines following the ancient railroad, and then we have the plains. This was one of our last lectures last semester. So what does Haussmann do? Well, with the livestock, he decides that the easiest way to bring them in, because of how heavy it is through canals. So he's going to hook it up right where a canal is. It's also right close to a railroad in case you decide to go that way. So this right here is going to become the Hall de la Villette, where we're going to bring in the livestock to be slaughtered and then distributed throughout Paris. This is what it looks like today, so it's part of a park/museum. But back in the day, this is what it would have looked like. You can see it's absolutely immense to house enough to supply the entire city. They had all sorts of animals here. So cows, sheep, chickens, they brought them all to this warehouse. And then they would have separate areas where they would practice slaughtering them. And then they would actually distribute them in that same day. Again, they couldn't refrigerate meat at the time, so it had to be very fresh in order for it to not be contaminated. Number 11, we have new recreation. So this is the last thing that Haussmann does, but really one of the largest. So this right here, notice our rings of Paris, is going to be our city wall at the time. And notice that right on the outside of the city wall, we have these two major lawns of greenery that become our new centers of recreation, otherwise known as our public parks. So prior to this, we only have our royal squares and our royal gardens, and notice that as big as those are, they're really no match to the scale of the new urban parks. So notice, first off, urban parks are going to be on the outskirts of town. Why? Because they're going to be very large, and the land there is already not really in use, so you might as well build them out here. Secondly, the type of terrain it's going to be on is going to be your toughest terrain because it's going to be to the advantage of the park. It's not only going to be cheaper because no one wants to build on it, but it's also going to create some nice heights to give us variation, and it's going to allow us to build things like grottos, waterfalls, hiking trails. So it gives us variety to have many means of recreation. The parks movement. So with your cities based in the US, the park movement is going to be very relative as well. So I hope you all have done research on this in the context of your city. But the 19th century has this newfound interest in creating parks because it is believed that they are, number one, going to promote cleaner cities. Number two, it's going to create recreational areas to appease that middle class and eventually the working class. And number three, we're going to have new property value around the park. So we're now opening a new section of development where we're going to have people who want to live in a nice area spend a lot of money to live right next to it. So it's really a great movement on many fronts. And what we also see is that we segment the parks into class as well. So our upper class is probably going to be watching polo, something upper class is into. Middle class might be promenading, courting. And then working class, this is where we have sports fields come in. So usually, in order to appease your working class, you would have soccer fields. I don't really know what other sports they play in Paris. But they would essentially have your sports fields so that the working class men can have something to do whenever they have some downtime, rather than be revolting and building barricades. So when you study the plan of an actual park, you can actually understand who who it's catering to in each part. And that comes all the way down to our modern day parks. So notice we have our outermost wall over here, right? We have our bastions still in place. And then right outside that is where we develop our park. So on this left side, we have a place for horse races to go on. So we know this is gonna be upper class-ish. Then we have our strolling parks, and then we're gonna have some sports fields come up on the north, which is where we're gonna have the working class. So even within a public park like this, we still have a certain level of social segregation going on. So these are the sort of activities you can expect to have in a park at this time period. So you can go through it in a carriage. You can stroll through the actual landmarks of it, and this is why it's good to have a number of different terrain types, so that you can have things like lakes and hills and grottos. They also host picnics, social events out here. This is another park. This is going to be the one on the right side of Paris. And notice the shape of it is a little odd because, again, they're just sort of taking the worst terrain they can find and they're remaking that into a park. Notice the railroad goes through it, right? So sometimes, in order to cover up the fact that we have a lot of industrialization going on, notice that there's more over here, they decided to build parks where the railroads ran to beautify that area and sort of hide the industrial nature of the city underneath a beautiful park. They also begin to create Disneyland sort of landscapes. So this is actually fake, right? This is a completely fake rock that they made, and I think you can kind of tell that this isn't a real rock, the way it's constructed. And then they would add these little follies up on top and create these optical illusions that this was somehow an old ruin that was just found on the outskirts of Paris. All of this is fake, all of these rocks that they created. But it was a form of escapism. Because the city was so industrial, having something like this as an alternative was actually really nice. And it gave people sort of peace of mind that nature still existed outside of the city walls. And this is where we have famous paintings like these come from. The idea of recreation is invented in the 19th century, and the idea that people have Sundays off and they can go do things like be in a park is also invented during the 19th century. And also the idea of pets, right? Prior to this, you're not going to take in a pet if you are in the middle or working class, because you can barely afford to feed yourself. But now, notice they even have more exotic type of pets going on. Other forms of recreation, we also have permanent exhibit halls and opera houses. So sometimes we have interior recreation. So we have something like this, which is pretty much like the Crystal Palace of France, where if you are in the middle class, you can go stroll on a Sunday and see what all the new products are, order them off a catalog for your personal home. And then we have the Opera House. So I'm going to focus on this for the next couple of minutes. If we do not get to Vienna, I'll just give you the answer to number 5 and we'll talk about it on Thursday. But we're going to talk about the Opera House for now. So first off, I want you to notice and plan the Opera House is incredibly large, right? So the actual stage and the theater are just going to be this right here, which begins to raise the question, why do you need all of this other space if the point of this is simply to host a show? So there it is, the visual termination of all of these different axes moving through the city. Here's the front of it. Here's our pedestrian entrance. And we know because we're reading the language of the building, right? We have this open arcade, covered portico, and it's ground level. And then on the other side, we know that this is the carriage entrance, again, by reading the language of the actual building. It's wide enough to fit carriage, right? If this was for pedestrians, it'd be a lot thinner. And then it's also a covered portico. So if it's a rainy night and you're going out to the opera and you can afford to have carriage, you're going to be coming in here. And so we see how it's catering to different types of people within the same city. So this is a section of the Paris Opera House. This is one of my favorite buildings for several reasons. First off, the amount of segmentation it has going on, and secondly, I love this concept down here. So first, when you come in, we do have a pre-lobby entrance. This is where you would buy your tickets today. And notice we have salons up here, and then we also have our main lobby with more salons that lead into these chambers. So why do you think we need so many salons and lobbies prior to entering the actual theater? Yes.
To separate class?
To separate class, yes.
Socialize?
And to socialize. So it's both of those together. So by creating these really tall spaces, you're creating hierarchy. The more wealthy you are, the better off you'll be. And so you can afford to have a nice box. And you can watch everything that's going on here. So you know that although you're all in the same space, there is hierarchy. Some people are wealthier than others. And it's also a place where you can meet up and socialize as the middle class likes to do. The actual theater, you can see, is actually small compared to the body of the actual opera house. We have our stage, which is incredibly tall in order to pull backdrops and have stage backgrounds. And then we have this underground lake down here. So has anyone watched or heard of the Phantom of the Opera? So that does come from the Paris Opera House, and the myth does come because of this underground lake. Really, it's just a cistern though. So the reason Haussmann had to do this, or Garnier had to do this, was because this area of the city has a lot of water underneath it. And so what happens is, if you build this huge foundation that's flat, it's going to crack, right? Because you have all this weight. And so in order to stabilize it, and because we have all this groundwater that wants to come up, Garnier decided to let the water come in a controlled manner. So it's contained inside of here, and what that does is it relieves the pressure of the water from these areas on the sides, and it also anchors the opera house. So it acts as part of the foundation so that it doesn't overturn or crack. And then in the back we have the dancer's foyer, which I'll talk about in a second. Here's a 3D section to give you a better idea. So notice the cistern is built up on piles, so it's not just some big tank of water, it's actually built up structurally, and depending on how much pressure there is, the water can go up or it can go down. So the entrance of the opera house, what does this remind us of? This nice grand vestibule with a staircase where you either go up into the salon or down into some other salon.
Dramatic palace.
Yes, so the archetype we're seeing here is going to be our Germanic palace, which goes to show the level of, royalty that they wanted to give this new middle class space. And the staircase was especially large and wide in order to showcase what you were wearing. So that's why this lobby had to be so big, because essentially it's a fashion show where you show off what you're wearing in that night. And fashion is again associated with the idea of class. So if you're a very, very wealthy person, you can come in with something this large. And if you're not, you might be wearing something a little bit more modest, and you won't have the whole staircase to yourself. And then up here, the people that are waiting to get into their private boxes can watch you from their balconies. So it's about being seen and then seeing people as they come in after the fact. And this is what the view is from one of these balconies. So you can look down at what other people are doing, who's coming in, and you can decide who to socialize or not socialize with. Here's a painting depicting scenes from this time. So this is going to be the actual backstage, which is a very interesting image because we see how small the theater actually looks compared to how large that backstage area is. And also, the dichotomy of heavy industrialized pieces back here and then nice neoclassical language in the front. So I'm going to show you a little bit of the stage really quickly. So again, notice the scale of the theater. As large as it is, it's really small in comparison to the backstage, which is not only wide, but incredibly tall to fit all the sets. And then notice that back here we have this little interesting space. This is what we call the dancer's foyer. So once the curtains are drawn on the show, your ballerinas and your dancers would then go into this space. Notice that it does have equipment, so it's technically a dance hall, but notice that it is very ornate and very decorated. And that's because this wasn't just for dancers, it was also for the men who would come visit the dancers. So the upper bourgeoisie would usually have mistresses on the side, and to have a dancer was kind of considered a a level of status, right? So if you could have the top dancer or the top singer of the opera house, that was considered a very good thing as a man. And so in this back foyer, this is where you would go after the show is over, and you would come and socialize with the dancers here. And so if you look at the language of it architecturally, notice that it's not a very serious mode of neoclassical, right? We're playing around with it, very playful types of decor, and then we also have portraits of women and famous dancers up on top, which tells us that this space was not really considered a serious area of the opera house. It was considered leisurely. Then we have underneath the stage all of the mechanisms. So if you were recreating a sea battle, or you had like a ship that you wanted to move, you would need to use these underneath the stage. And then you can see the red right here is where the cistern begins to build up. So that is where our structural piers are going to begin to be anchored for the water that's underneath this space. So this is also where that myth that there's a pool under the stage comes from. All right, so this is what the cisterns look like underground. I'm going to show you another one just to give you another idea. So keep in mind that these do not have lighting in them. They are completely dark, and the only reason there's light is because they're doing a Google tour of it right now. Right, so as you enter these chambers, it's just rows and rows and rows of tunnels with water being built up, and then you would essentially have a foundation underneath these, and then the water would keep going. And what they do with this in the modern day is if you are training to be a firefighter in Paris, you have to go in here in the dark and you have to swim and have like a fake rescue operation in the water. So the water is actually relatively clean. It's just going to be a little cloudy because it's groundwater. But imagine going here in the dark, and this thing is a couple, dozen feet deep, and you don't really know what's down there. So it's a pretty scary thing, and that's why they do it as part of the training for firefighters. All right, so it looks like we have a couple of minutes, so I'll try to do Vienna very quickly. Vienna is going to be doing the same exact thing Paris is doing, but for today we're just going to be focusing on its biggest urban development, which is called the Ringstrasse. And as the name suggests, it's going to be in the shape of a ring. So Old Vienna is going to be in the red. It looks like this, right? This is going to be the imperial city. We have bastions, and then we have this green ring around it, which would have been the slope of that hill. The rest of the city, as it began to grow, happens outside of that green ring. And then eventually we come back and we realize we don't really need bastions anymore, and so we take them down, and we realize we now have this huge open space around the center of the city. So all of this green space is now empty. And they decide to have a big urban planning project on it, which is called the Ringstrasse, or the Ring Street. And so afterwards, it looks like this. And you can see that the avenue follows that ring shape. And along it, we have new parks, but also new facilities that again cater to that upper middle class. So this is now a nice street to promenade on, right? You can get to the library, to the theater. We even have universities beyond here. So this is what it looked like before, where you can see the inner city is very closed off and fortified. And this is what it looks like afterwards, where now we have this big boulevard moving through the city. It creates a new way to, orient yourself within the city itself, and it also adds a lot of amenities. So what we see in Vienna is the idea of the 19th century and borrowing styles. So during this time, we don't really see the 19th century having a specific type of architecture. Instead, they like to borrow from every time period and apply it as they see appropriate to the use of the building. So these are just a couple of views where notice that they're wide enough to even have public transportation, which is a 20th century invention. And today we have rails going up and down it. So, first off, we have the Parliament building. What style is it in?
Neoclassical.
Yes, we have a neoclassical building. Why would they choose this for the building that represents their government? Yes,
Classical represents like power and democracy.
yes. So Vienna at the time is an empire, but they're also a constitutional monarchy that has a parliament. So by giving this facade to the Parliament building, you're essentially telling the people, you two have a choice because your representatives in the government are going to speak for you. So our Parliament is going to be neoclassical. We also have a town hall. What style is the town hall in? Yes, so our town hall is going to be medieval. Why would they choose medieval for the town hall? Think about like the first lecture we had in this class. The town hall is invented during medieval ages, and it's the most powerful structure when we have the early Renaissance, and it's still associated with that idea of medievalism. So you're not going to make a neoclassical town hall, and you're also not going to make a eclectic town hall. You're going to make it specifically Gothic or more medieval style because that is the era it is associated with. So we're now having the idea of aesthetics arise during the 19th century. And then the last building we're going to look at is the university. What style is this in? Why would we choose the Renaissance for a university?
It's enlightenment and education.
Enlightenment.
Yes. What does Renaissance mean in English? It's the rebirth, right? So very appropriately, we're going to have a nice neoclassical revival in the Renaissance style for our university to symbolize that this is an institution of learning, of the rebirth of the Enlightenment. So to conclude, in 19th century planning, the goal is to make the city fit for the new middle class. And all of the things that we've seen eventually lead to creating a city that makes it a lot more permeable, a lot more beautiful. We now have lungs to allow the city to breathe. These are some of the new ideas that are introduced. So as you guys are studying your cities in this last week, keep in mind all the things we've talked about in Paris because they are going to influence what's going on in the United States as well. For Thursday, we are going to have a review session. So I did put up your guys' questions for the exam. If you haven't seen it, it's under assignments. And then it's going to be under assessment 1. All the questions that are going to be on the exam are going to be on here, so take a look at it. If you don't know the answer, we can go over on it on Thursday. And notice that I only went up to the 19th century city. So I'm not going to test you on anything that we're going to go over on Thursday. Thursday, first half is going to be looking at some 20th century trends, very briefly. And then the second half is going to be going over this with you guys. Okay? So make sure that you look over it. If you have any questions, I will answer them on Thursday.